In this episode, I'm going to introduce you Drizzle, a front-end framework for Ethereum dApps. We will also build a simple dApp using this framework, Truffle and React. This is a free episode of EatTheBlocks Pro. If you want to access the source code of this tutorial, go to EatTheBlocks Pro and create a free account by clicking on this button, Enroll Now. If you want to get access to even more video about Ethereum and Solidity programming, you can also purchase a subscription to EatTheBlocks Pro and you'll get access to more than 100 videos, including some extra video about Drizzle. First, we will see what is Drizzle. Then, I will show you when do you need it. Then, I will show you what are the integration with other frameworks. Then I will show you the components of Drizzle. Then I will show you how it works. And finally, we will do a dApp tutorial with Drizzle. First, what is Drizzle? Drizzle is a JavaScript framework to help you build the front end of your dApp. It's available as an NPM package, so you can install it very simply with your command line. It was released by the team of the Truffle framework in early 2018, and it's pretty much to this date the only front-end framework for dApps. In the JavaScript world, whenever a new front-end framework is introduced, people always wonder, what is the purpose of this? Is it really useful? That's a fair question. So you probably noticed that there is a lot of boilerplate code when you deal with Web3, like, for example, when you import the contract artifact or when you configure the Web3 object. Beside this, you also have to write the code for calling the function of your smart contract, and it can be quite repetitive. Drizzle reduces this boilerplate code a lot and simplifies the integration of your frontend with the smart contract. With Drizzle, a lot of the integration with your smart contract becomes declarative instead of imperative, a little bit like the difference between CSS and JavaScript, for example. In other words, you just need to do the right configuration and Drizzle will figure out the rest. Now that you know a bit more about Drizzle, a good question to ask yourself is, when do you actually need it and how does it compare to just using Web3? There is no exact answer, but generally speaking, with Drizzle, you can get started much faster than by just using Web3. You just need a few configurations and you can start to communicate with your smart contract right away. There are two downsides though. First, you need to do some extra learning compared to just using Web3. And second, it can be also a little bit less flexible than just using Web3. This being said, Drizzle is very modular and you can choose to use more or less components depending on how much flexibility you need and which integration with other framework you want. Speaking of integration, how does Drizzle integrate with other framework? On the front-end side, Drizzle can be used with different frameworks, even though it was primarily developed for React. Under the hoods, it uses Redux and Saga, two popular libraries for state management in React. You don't have to use these libraries in your application, but if you do, it's possible to integrate your reducers and your sagas with the ones of Drizzle. Drizzle also uses Web3, and you can still access the Web3 object in your code if you need more flexibility. That's a nice escape hatch to have. On the backend, in theory, you could use any smart contract framework you want. Drizzle imports a JSON file that describes your smart contract. All that Drizzle requires is that this JSON file follows the format of a library called Truffle Contract Artifact, with, among other things, some fields like the ABI and the deployment address of the smart contract. If you really want it, you could use a framework different from Truffle and take care yourself of creating the contract artifact. But unless you have a very good reason to do so, it's more simple to just use Truffle and it will produce this contract artifact out of the box. Next, let's talk about the component of Drizzle. Drizzle has three main components: Drizzle, React Drizzle, and React Drizzle components. Drizzle is the library that holds the core of the logic of Drizzle. It is framework agnostic, which means you can plug it to any other front-end framework like React, Vue, or Angular. You can just use this and integrate Drizzle manually with the rest of your application if you want. React Drizzle allows you to easily integrate Drizzle to your React application. It provides a higher order provider component that wraps your other components and passes them down the state of Drizzle. And finally, there is the React Drizzle components, which provides some ready-to-use React components for your application, such as a component to display accounts, a component to read the data from your smart contract, and another one to write the data. Just a word of caution. In this tutorial, we are going to use both Drizzle, React Drizzle, and React Drizzle components. Depending on the tutorial that you will find online, they use more or less of these components. For example, the official tutorial does not use React Drizzle components. Alright, so now let's see how it works. First, Drizzle needs to know which smart contract you track, and it does this with a configuration object. Then Drizzle will do two things. First, it will connect to the Ethereum blockchain with Web3. Then, it will maintain its own copy of the state of the smart contract in a Redux store client side. It will take care of maintaining this data up to date. You don't have to do anything. Then it will relay transactions to the smart contract, or in other words, it will relay all the data writes. The synchronization with the data of the smart contract is really crucial, so let's give more detail. First, Drizzle subscribes to new block header using Web3. Block headers contain metadata about each block in the blockchain. Whenever a new block header comes in, Drizzle checks if it contains any transaction relevant to the contract we're watching as configured initially. If it does, it updates its state, otherwise it just ignores the block header. One last thing I would like to tell you about the inner workings of Drizzle is that even though the data is kept up to date by Drizzle, it's up to the developer of the Dapp to re-render the UI when the data of Drizzle changes. This can be done simply using React and React Drizzle. So now it's time for our Dapp tutorial with Drizzle. We are going to create a very simple storage smart contract. Our smart contract will be able to get and set a variable. On the front end, we are going to build a UI to be able to interact with a smart contract. Beside the core package of Drizzle, we are also going to use React Drizzle and React Drizzle components, as well as Truffle and React. Alright, so go to your terminal and we are going to start the coding. So first, for this tutorial, you need to have installed the truffle command line. So if you haven't done so already, you can do this very easily with npm install -g truffle, and it's going to install the command line. So I already have it, I don't need to do it. So now I want to create a folder for our project, so I'm going to create a folder called Drizzle, and inside Drizzle we're going to init a truffle project. So here, truffle init, enter. So now if I check what is inside our directory, then you will recognize the typical truffle folder layout. By the way, I'm using truffle version 5, so this is an important precision. Just make sure you have at least truffle version 5. If you're using an older version, then you might have some problem with this tutorial. So make sure to update before following this tutorial. Okay, so let me clear up my screen. And first, I would like to create a very simple smart contract. So as I mentioned before, our smart contract will be a simple storage smart contract that has a single variable, and we'll have two functions. One function to set the value of this variable and another function to get the value of this variable. Very easy. So let's create a new file in contract and we'll call this storage.sol. So we'll start with the pragma statement. So pragma solidity 0.5.0. So you can use a newer version of solidity if you want, as long as it's at least 0.5 something. Then we create our contract, so contract storage, and then we define our variable. So we call our variable is of type string. That's a public variable, and we call it data. Next, we're going to create a getter function. So a getter function will return the value of our data variable. So function, we'll call this get data, doesn't take any argument. That's a function of type view, so it doesn't modify the data of the smart contract. That's an external function, so it can be called from outside the smart contract, and it returns a string of memory location memory, and inside it just return data. By the way, as you have probably noticed, actually this getter function is not strictly necessary, because when you declare a variable as a public in Solidity, it automatically creates a getter function with the same name of the variable. So that means that we'll have a getter function called data here. But just to make things explicit, I want to create this get data function. Alright, so now we're going to create our second function, that's our setter function that can modify the value of data. So function set data, it takes a single argument, that's a string, so string of memory location called data, because our function will be external. And we're gonna call the parameter underscore data. And here we're gonna make this external. Okay, so open the curly braces, and very simply, we're just gonna assign underscore data to data. Very easy. So I keep this smart contract very simple because the point is not to teach you very complex smart contract, but the point of this video is to teach you Drizzle. However, even if the smart contract is very simple, we'll still have a getter function and a setter function, so data read and data write. So those are the two kind of functions that you will find in all your smart contract, including the most complex one. So it will still be applicable to more complex smart contract. Okay, so let's open a new terminal, and I'm gonna try to compile my smart contract just to make sure that there is no error. Truffle compile. Okay, everything works fine. So now the next thing we need to do is to create a migration file so that we're able to deploy our smart contract to the blockchain. So we can use the truffle command line to help us. So truffle create migration, and we call this migration storage. So truffle just created a migration in a migration folder. So that's the first thing that you see on my screen. So let's go back to the code editor, and we're going to edit this migration file. So usually I never remember exactly how to write this migration. So my little trick is that I always copy the other migration file that is created by Truffle for another smart contract that is called migration. That's a smart contract that is used internally by Truffle. We don't need to take care of it, but it's quite handy to just copy paste the migration from here. So let's go back to our migration file. I just paste what I got from Truffle, and basically I'm going to replace all the instances of migrations by storage. So here I'm going to use some vim foo, but if you have your own code editor, probably you can do the same. So migration, it's going to be replaced by storage, and okay, and so normally it should work. Okay, so everything has been replaced. So back to our other window, and what I want to do now is to deploy our smart contract and make sure that everything works. So first, let's spin up a Truffle console. So Truffle develop. So it's going to start an instance of Ganache, and we're going to land right inside the Truffle console. Okay, so inside I'm going to run the migrate -- reset command. Sorry, it's at the bottom of the screen. It's a little bit cut. So it's going to take a couple of seconds, and I see that the migration worked fine. So everything is good, no error in Solidity, and we are able to deploy our smart contract. Cool, so now it's time to start our front end. So as I mentioned before, for the front end, we are going to use React, but I don't really want to bother to set up React myself. It's a little bit troublesome, takes some time. So we are going to use Create React App. That's a very famous dependency on GitHub that is used to bootstrap your React application. If you're a front-end developer, you're probably very familiar with this. If you've never heard about it, it's a good chance to learn about this project. It's very handy to start your React app. So we are going to use this. That's a npm package, so it's very easily installable. So back to our terminal, I'm going to open another terminal window. And in this terminal window, if you've never used Create React App before, you can install it very easily with npm install -g create React app. Here again, the global flag is important because you want to be able to use this CLI from anywhere on your operating system. So me, I already have it, so I don't need to install it. And the next thing to do once it's installed is to use this CLI. So create React app and then space, and you give it the name of the project, to the folder to create. So we're gonna create a folder called app. And also we're going to use the --use -npm flag, so that allow you to create a React app using the npm package manager. Otherwise it's going to default to yarn. So that is optional, but for this tutorial, let's just keep it simple and we're going to use npm for everything. So press enter and it's going to bootstrap everything. And at the end of the installation, you'll see a couple of commands that you can execute in your newly created React application. The most important one is npm start. That's how you start your Webpack dev server and you'll be able to see your application on the front end. Okay, so let's go in the app folder. Let's clear up my screen and let's see what is inside. That is a typical folder layout for a React project. So in public, you have all the static assets, including the HTML page. And in the src folder, that's where you have all the source code for JavaScript. So you have index.js file. So that's how we're going to bootstrap our React app. And you have app.js, which is the main component of the app. So we're going to work a lot on this component. And also in your own Drizzle project, if your app is actually more complex, then you also have some other component in this src folder. And there are also some other files that we're going to ignore, like a logo, like the test file, the CSS, and the service worker. We won't need this one. So now we are going to install Drizzle by installing a couple of npm packages. Inside the app folder, we're going to run npm install Drizzle, drizzle-react, and drizzle-react-components. The first package is the core package of Drizzle. It can be used standalone. The second package is the adapter that allows you to connect Drizzle to React. And the last package is some extra React components that are useful when using Drizzle. Okay, so now Drizzle is installed. Next, we are going to configure it. So for this, we are going to create a configuration file that we are going to put in the src directory. So let's create this file, so src, and the file is called drizzleoptions.js. You don't have to call your configuration file like this, but it's generally a convention that is followed with Drizzle project. In this file, we are going to create a JavaScript object to configure Drizzle. This file can take several keys, but the only required key is contracts. Contract is an array of the different contract artifacts that will be managed by Drizzle. We are going to manage only one contract artifact, which is for our storage smart contract. So let's define this storage variable, and we will need to reference the JSON file that was produced by Truffle when we compiled the smart contract. So this JSON file is not inside the Drizzle project, but it's inside the Truffle project. So we need to go back to directory before we can access this folder. Okay, so that's it for the required option of Drizzle. Next, we're going to add an optional option to Drizzle, and that's going to be for the connection to Web3. So I'm going to paste a snippet. So here I have a Web3 key, and this Web3 key takes another key that is called fallback. So Drizzle is going to use this option if it doesn't find any injected Web3 provider. So basically, if you don't have MetaMask installed. So in our case, I don't want to use MetaMask during development because that's a little bit troublesome. That forces us to also configure MetaMask, and this is slightly outside the scope of this video tutorial. So I just like to avoid this. So we're gonna use a browser session without MetaMask installed, and so Drizzle is gonna fall back using this option here that we specify, and it's gonna connect to our Ganache instance. And finally, we need to export our option object so that we can use it from other modules. So let's do an export default options. Okay. There are many other options that you can put in the options object. And if you want to know more about this, you can check out the documentation of Drizzle at this URL, and you have a complete description of all the other things that you can put inside. In this tutorial, we are going to put another key a little bit later, but first I want to show you something else. So let's just take a pause on the configuration now. Okay, so now let's open the main component of our app. So it's src app.js. And so we're going to first do some cleanup because there's some stuff that we don't need. So this is some boilerplate code that was created by the Create React App CLI. So first of all, we don't need the logo. We don't care also about the CSS. What else? Pretty much everything that is inside. Actually, we don't really care. So let's get rid of everything. Okay. And in this component, we're going to first configure Drizzle. So first, we're going to import the Drizzle options that we just created. So import Drizzle option from Drizzle option. Normally, we have to import the Drizzle object and instantiate it using the Drizzle options and then manually connect it to our React app. But this is a tedious process, and there is a more convenient solution using the drizzle-react package that we installed just before. So let's do this. So let's import a component that is called drizzle provider, and that's a component that you can find in the drizzle-react package. So from drizzle-react. So this is a higher order component that's gonna wrap the other component of your React application, and it's going to instantiate this drizzle object and pass a few objects to child component that will allow these child components to interact with drizzle. So it's going to make everything more simple. So once we have imported this, then in our return statement here in our render function, then we're going to reference this higher order component like this. So drizzle provider. And this component takes a single prop, so that's a prop called options. And these options, we're going to pass it drizzle options. And then we're going to close this component. And basically all our other React components, they're going to be inside. So that's it for setting up and configuring Drizzle. Now we need to run the front end, but just before I need to give a child component to this Drizzle provider component, otherwise it's going to complain. So let's just create like a dummy component. We're just gonna call it storage Dapp, and here we close our div. Okay, so now open a new terminal window. Inside the app directory, so this is the directory of Drizzle, then you execute npm start, and it's going to start the Webpack dev server and basically send you to the your web browser where you will be able to see the front end. So in my case, I'm already running another application on port 3000, so it's basically it's going to find another available port for me. But in your case, if the port 3000 is available, it's not going to tell you this. Then you're going to be taken to a new tab in your browser. So just here a word of caution. If you have MetaMask installed in your browser, it's not going to work properly because I want to avoid using MetaMask. So in this case, you're going to take the same URL, but you're going to load it in an incognito session of Chrome. And that will basically allow us to totally bypass MetaMask and directly connect to Ganache. But of course, in production, user will need to connect with MetaMask and they will not connect directly to Ganache, of course. Alright, so with this being said, let's move on. So Webpack is showing me an error. Failed to compile. What is the problem, my friend? Module not found. You attempted to import contract storage.json, which falls outside of the project src directory. Okay, so the problem here is that the Create React App utility that we use to kickstart our React project does not allow import outside the src directory. So if I come back to my terminal and I show you what we have inside our directory, so ls src, so this is all our source code for JavaScript, but we cannot import anything that is outside this directory. Create React App does this for security, just that so that you don't do any mistake. However, in our case, we have a problem because our contract artifact is outside this directory. So how are we going to do this? So actually, there are three solutions to this. So first, we could create a symboling link from the build directory of Truffle to a directory inside our src directory. So with the ln-s command, you can achieve, ln-s command, you can achieve this. Then another solution would be to modify the Webpack configuration of create React app so that we don't have this rule of not being able to import anything outside the src directory. So for this, you will need to first eject the React app, so that will basically export the Webpack configuration of the project, and in this Webpack configuration you will need to delete the configuration of the module scope plugin. So first eject, then remove module scope plugin from Webpack. And the last solution, so that's the most simple, that's what we are going to do, is to change the configuration of truffle to save the contract artifact in another directory inside our src directory. So change configuration of truffle. So we're going to do this. So now open the configuration file of truffle. That's truffle-config.js. So you should see some comment to give you some basically some tips if you want to configure your truffle project, but we can ignore everything. And when you see module.exports, we're going to add something to this configuration object. So let's add a new line just below, and we're going to add contract underscore build underscore directory. And the path that we're going to give is, so first we want to enter the app folder where we have our Drizzle project, then the src directory where we have all our JavaScript source file, and inside this src directory we're going to put all our contract artifact in a contracts folder. So you don't need to manually create this folder. Truffle is going to do it itself next time it compiles the smart contract. Okay, so now we need to recompile our smart contract and redeploy them to the blockchain. Oops, actually I forgot a comma after this key. So now we need to go to our truffle console and redeploy our smart contract, which will also recompile it to and place the contract artifact in a new folder that we just defined in the configuration of truffle. So if you just go ahead and run the migrate -- reset command in the truffle console, you might think that it's fine, but actually it's not, because this truffle console has not picked up yet on the new configuration of truffle. So we need to exit this truffle console with Ctrl+C 2 times. And then we're going to relaunch it, so truffle develop, and this time it's going to pick up on the new configuration of truffle and place the contract artifact in the new directory. So here I run migrate -- reset, and now if I check the content of our new contracts folder, then it should not be empty. So ls src contract, and I can see my contract artifact. Cool, so now let's modify the import path of our contract artifact in our drizzle option file. So let's go to our drizzle option file, and here when we import our storage contract artifact, this time we're not gonna go outside the src directory, but we can just go to the new contracts directory, and Webpack should be happy now. So if I go to my front end, I can see that now I'm able to run the front end without any errors. So what we just did with the custom contract folder worked. We solved our problem. Cool. So now we have our Drizzle application set up, but we're not doing anything with it. We're not interacting with the smart contract. So let's go back to our code and let's see how we can interact with our smart contract. So before we're able to interact with our smart contract, I need to show you what are the different objects that are provided by this Drizzle provider component. So we are going to create a container component, and this container component is going to connect to the Redux store provided by Drizzle provider, and we're going to console log the content of this Redux store and see what is inside. So let's create this new component. So in the same directory, so the src directory, let's create a file called container.js. So we're going to import the usual stuff when we start a React component. So import React, curly braces component from React. And here let's create our class component. So class container extends component. Okay, and we're going to export this component, export default container. Okay. So next, let's define a render function. So render, and this render function first is going to console log these props. So these props will be connected to the Redux store. So we will see all the content of the Redux store thanks to this console log statement. And after, we're just gonna return for now just a dummy HTML. So div storage, okay. So if you use Redux before, you know that in order to connect a component to your Redux store, you need to use the connect function of Redux. For Drizzle, it's exactly the same thing. There is also a connect function, but this time Drizzle provided itself. So let's import this Drizzle connect function. So import Drizzle connect. I have some problem with the spelling. Drizzle connect. Okay, that's correct. And this is from drizzle-react. So the same package that we used before for our provider component. Next, we need to define a map state to props function. So again, exactly the same as with Redux. So here, let's define this function, map state to props. So this function is going to be used by Drizzle Connect to know how to map its Redux state to the props of the container. So this is a function that's going to take a single argument, the state, and it's going to return an object that defines the relationship between state and props. So I just want to make it simple, and I just want to see the entirety of the state. So here my props will be a prop called state, and I will just assign the state to it. But actually with ES6 we don't even need to do this. You can just close the curly braces, and this is absolutely equivalent to what I just showed you before. So Drizzle Connect will basically put the entire Redux store in a property called state in our props. So this is a little bit silly, but we just do this to be able to console log everything. And then we make use of Drizzle Connect. So here we're going to wrap our container component with Drizzle Connect. So Drizzle Connect. So the first argument will be our component, and the second argument will be map state to props. So map state to props. Okay. And now we need to render this component in our app. So back to our app component, and instead of this storage tab HTML, here we're gonna render our new component. So that's gonna be container. And here we close the tag, and we also import the container. So import container from container. Okay, by the way, it's better to group your dependency and separate them from other dependencies. So here the drizzle options, I'm gonna put it below. Okay, so now let's see in the front end what we have. Okay, so this is our front end. So now let's open the JavaScript console and see what we have inside. So we have this object. So this is the entire Redux store, and what we're interested in is this state key. So let's expand this and let's see what is inside. So this is what the Drizzle provider has done for us. So we have our 10 accounts. These are accounts provided by Ganache. So there are tens of them, and there are also the account balances. So these balances are kept up to date by Drizzle. So if there is any change, and this will auto update. So this is really cool. Then the most interesting is this contracts key. Inside you will find entries for all the smart contract that we define in the Drizzle option file. Every time you call a read-only function of your smart contract, the result of the call is going to be stored in one of these entries. So here you can see that we have different entries for each of the function of the smart contract. And inside these entries, once you start to make a call to your smart contract, then the result of this call will be stored there, indexed by argument value. So if you call the same function with two different arguments, then you will have two entries. Then if you scroll down, you will see some other key like current block or drizzle status. So drizzle status allow you to know when you can use drizzle. So here we can see it's initialized, but at the beginning drizzle status is not initialized. So as long as it's not initialized, you need to show a loading screen, and we will see just after how to do this really simply using drizzle-react-components. And after you have a transaction stack and a transaction key that allow you to respectively know the status of pending transaction and of transaction that were already done. And then you have a Web3 key that tells you if Web3 is initialized or not and which network we're on. Okay, so now that we finished our tour of the Redux store provided by the Drizzle provider component, let's go back to our app component. And now I would like to wait for the Drizzle object to be ready before we render the rest of the child component. So we can do this manually by checking out the Drizzle status key of the state of Drizzle, like I showed you just before, but we can do something even more simple by using a loading component using the drizzle-react component package. So let's do this. So just before the import drizzle provider, we're going to do another import. So we're going to import loading container from drizzle react components. And then we're going to wrap our container component inside our return statement by this loading container. Here, loading container. And just below, we're going to close our loading container. Okay. So now container is only going to be rendered when drizzle is ready. Before the loading container is going to show a loading screen. So we're going to save this and see in the front end how it looks like. So in my browser, if I force a reload manually, then you will see a very quick flickering with a loading screen. So you can try it a couple of times if you didn't see clearly. So it just shows you that this loading component is working properly. Okay, so now the next step is to set up a component to be able to actually interact with our smart contract. So if you remember, we have two functions, one function to get the data and another function to set the data. So in our component, we will need to have a user interface for these two functions. So let's go back to our code editor and we are going to create a new file. So src, and I will call this my component. And in this new file, so we set up the usual React code. So import React from React. So this time it's going to be a functional component. So const my component equals, it doesn't take any argument. We're going to ignore the props and it's going to return. So just a precision here, the fact that I use the parentheses and not a curly braces is not an error. It's an ES6 notation that allows you to return directly what is inside the parentheses without the return statement. And inside this div, we're going to do several things. So first, we are going to display the account balances. So there are several ways to do this. So one way is to make use of the drizzle state directly and fetch the data that we need. But there is a more simple way using the drizzle react components. So we're going to do the simple way. So just below React, we're going to import our first component. So this component is called account data and we get it from drizzle react components. And the way to use it is very simple. So inside the div, we reference the account data component and we can pass it different props. So the first one is the index of the account that we want to show. So that's the account index key. And we want the first account. So here we pass 0. Careful, because if you check the documentation of Drizzle React components on GitHub, the documentation is outdated and they will show you a string instead of a number. But if you do this, you're going to see an error in the console. So just don't follow this outdated documentation. Then we can also specify which units we want. So units equal ether. For other unit, you can check the GitHub repo. And we can also set up the precision, so how many decimal we want. So for that, let's say that I want 3 decimal. Okay, and then I close my tag here. Okay, and then I'm gonna put a little description. Here it's gonna be balance of first account. So next we need another component to display the value of the data variable inside our smart contract, and we can get the value of this variable by executing the getData function. So first we need to import a new component from Drizzle React components. That's a component that is called contract data. Contract data allow you to read value from your smart contract. So here we're gonna do another h2 title and we're gonna call this getData. And after, we're gonna use our contract data component. And so this component has several props. The first one is the contract props. So you need to tell this component which smart contract are you referencing. So in our case, we are referencing storage. By the way, this is not related to the name of the variable in your drizzle options file, but this is related to the name of your smart contract in Solidity. So in your Solidity code, if you define your contract with a lowercase s, then here it also needs to be lowercase. Well, in our case, it's uppercase, so we'll leave it like this. Then another prop that you need to pass is the method props. So you need to tell the contract data component which method are you calling on the storage smart contract. So in our case is the get data method. So once again, this needs to be exactly the same name as in your Solidity code. That's going to be all the props that we're going to pass to the contract data component, but there are some other props. For example, if this is a method that accepts an argument, then you can use the method args prop, and this prop is going to expect an array of arguments. So if your first argument is 0, for example, then the first entry in the array will be 0. If the second argument is a string bb, for example, then here it's going to be bb, etc, etc. So we don't have any arguments, so let's get rid of this. Then you have different format props that you can pass. So for example, to UTF-8, so that is a Boolean prop, so you don't need to do anything else like to UTF equal true. You just need to pass this component and it will set it to true. So this is useful, for example, if you return some bytes value and you want them to be converted to UTF-8, which is human readable. Similarly, you also have to ASCII, so this is also useful if you have some bytes value as well. But in our case, this is already a string in a smart contract, so we don't need this. And finally, you can hide the loading indicator if you want with the hide indicator Boolean prop. Again, we're not going to use it. Okay, so let's close this tag. And then lastly, we need to be able to call the setData function to change the value of the data variable. So we're going to need another component from drizzle-react-components. So let's go up and actually let's put every import on its own line because we start to have a lot of import here. And for the last import, that's going to be a component called contract form. So let's go back inside our myComponent function, and here for our new title, it's going to be set data. So we close the title, and after we render our contract form component, so this is for function where you change the data of the smart contract. So any function which doesn't have view, pure, or constant keyword will need to be used with the contract form component. So the API is very similar to the contract data component. So first you need to specify the contract. So that's the same contract storage. Then you need to specify the method. So our method is set data. Then you obviously don't have a method args props because that's going to be a form that is displayed to users. So the value of the argument will be provided by the user. We don't know it in advance. However, there is another props that does not exist in the contract data component, which is called labels. So labels will allow you to specify which label you want next to each form. So label is going to receive an array of strings. The first string is what is shown next to the first input. So our first and only input is for the data parameter. So here we're going to put a new value of data. Okay, and here I'm going to close the array and close my curly brace. Okay, and then I'm going to close also my component tag. Okay, oops, and I forgot to close my single quote. Okay, now it's fine. Oh, actually, let's rearrange the prop to make it a little bit more tidy. So everybody on its own line. So there is space for everybody. Okay, cool. So now we're done with my component. So now we need to make use of it. So back to the app component. So we're going to import it. So import my component from my component. And actually we can get rid of the container because we don't need it anymore. And here we render my component. And notice how we don't need to take care of passing the drizzle object to my component. Because we are using drizzle-react-components, then we don't need to use drizzle connect like we did in the container component. So this is extremely convenient to use drizzle-react-components. However, the condition to be able to use drizzle-react-component is that you wrap all your component with a drizzle provider. If you forget to do this, then the drizzle-react-components are going to complain. Okay, so here I've saved my app component. So I'm going to go back to my web browser and there is an error. I forgot to export my component. Bad, Julian, you made a mistake. Okay, let's go back to my component and we're going to export it. So export default my component. All right, let's go back to our browser and this time, cool, this time Drizzle is happy. So we have three sections here. So first, this section is the account data component, balance of first account. So we can see the address of the account and the balance of the account. So it's about 100 Ether. So the difference with 100 Ether is because we use this account to do our contract deployment. So it costs a little bit of gas, and so gas is Ether. So that's why we don't have exactly 100. Then get data. So get data does not show anything because our data variable was not initialized. So by default, it's an empty string. And finally, the set data function that allows us to change the value of the data variable. So we have a form and a submit button that was created by Drizzle. And we also can see the label that we pass as a prop to the contract from component. So here we're going to use it. We're going to say that our new value for data is hello. So between double quote, let's click on submit and magically my get data component auto update. This is super cool. We didn't have to take care of the logic of refetching the data from the smart contract. Drizzle automatically keep our client side state in sync with the state of the smart contract. So that is really super cool. This is very powerful and I can really simplify your smart contract. So I really hope that you understand the value of Drizzle now. This is extremely powerful. And by the way, just to make it clear, here in the set data function, if we had several arguments for our function, then we would have had several input fields, but just a single submit button, and it would have worked exactly the same. So that's it for this long introduction to Drizzle. Sorry for the long duration, but there was really a lot of things to say about Drizzle. This is a very convenient framework, but it's also not very easy to understand, and the documentation is not always up to date, as I mentioned during this tutorial, so you gotta be careful of what you read online. Before we finish this video, I would like to make it clear that what I taught you in this tutorial is just one way of using Drizzle. But as I mentioned, Drizzle is actually very flexible and you can use more or less component. So if we go back to our app component, that means that, for example, Drizzle React and Drizzle React components were two totally optional dependencies. If we wanted more flexibility, we could have created our Drizzle object ourselves, and we could also have created our components ourselves instead of using Drizzle React components. If you are a paid member of EatTheBlocks Pro, you'll get access to my other video on advanced Drizzle. In this video, I will show you how we can do without Drizzle React and without Drizzle React components by writing our own custom React component for Drizzle. And the last thing I'd like to tell you before we finish this video is drizzle-blocks. So drizzle-blocks is a pre-configured Drizzle project that you can very easily download on your computer using the truffle unbox drizzle command. So with this command, you will have a whole skeleton of Drizzle app. So it is already integrated with Truffle. It has already a couple of smart contracts and example on how to set up the relevant UI with Drizzle and React. So if you are really in a hurry, that is the absolute fastest way to get started with Drizzle. Make sure to subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this. And if you have any question, you can ask them in the comment of this video. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.